Why have some of the most brilliant minds in history chosen solitude over society? What drives great thinkers to turn away from social life? And is isolation truly a curse or rather a rare privilege reserved for the intellectually gifted? Arthur Schopenhauer, one of the most pessimistic yet insightful philosophers of the 19th century, had an unflinching response to these questions. For him, society was largely composed of shallow individuals, guided by petty impulses, entangled in meaningless conversations, and addicted to trivial distractions. Genius, in its very essence, demanded a distance from such mediocrity. As he once wrote, "Solitude is the fate of all exceptional spirits." But was he right in this belief, or is this disdain for social interaction simply a sign of a deeper inability to connect with others? Think of names like Nikola Tesla, Emily Dickinson, or Isaac Newton. Each of them is remembered not only for their extraordinary minds but also for their preference for solitude. Were they examples of brilliance that could not coexist with the ordinary world, or simply misunderstood souls, destined to walk through life alone? Today we take a closer look at Schopenhauer's ideas to understand why intelligent individuals often appear detached from social life, and whether this detachment is a true advantage or just an elegant form of alienation. To Schopenhauer, solitude was not a matter of personal choice, it was the inevitable result of intellectual superiority. The more an individual rises in mental capacity, the harder it becomes to find others on the same level with whom one can share profound thoughts and meaningful experiences. In his view, higher intelligence creates a natural barrier between the individual and society, as the average person is generally preoccupied with concerns that feel insignificant to someone with a broader perspective of life and the world. According to Schopenhauer, a man can be himself only so long as he is alone, and if he does not love solitude, he does not love freedom, for it is only when he is alone that he is truly free. In this context, solitude was not just a burden to be endured, but a sanctuary to be cherished. He believed that society, with all its unwritten rules and expectations, suffocated the intellect. The social world was, to him, a place where deep thinking was stifled by the need to conform to common interests and superficial norms. He observed that individuals with heightened intellectual awareness often experienced a profound sense of disconnection when trying to engage with the everyday world. They could see beyond the obvious and comprehend realities that most people could not even begin to grasp. This experience of disconnection, of living in a world that could not understand them, pushed these individuals further into solitude. History offers numerous examples to support Schopenhauer's viewpoint. Nikola Tesla, for instance, spent the majority of his life alone, deliberately avoiding human interaction as much as possible, convinced that it would disrupt his focus and creativity. Similarly, Friedrich Nietzsche, another philosopher who praised solitude, once remarked that the crowd is a sea in which free spirits drown. These thinkers seem to find in isolation not only peace but also the mental space needed to explore the deepest corners of their minds. However, this kind of isolation does not come without its cost. The decision to detach from social conventions often leads to a profound sense of alienation. Schopenhauer was aware of this paradox. While solitude could liberate the great thinker from societal mediocrity, it could also become a burden, weighing heavily on the soul. As a result, many of history's greatest minds endured periods of depression, anxiety, and emotional suffering. Not because they were weak, but because they were able to perceive layers of human existence that others could not even imagine. And so the fundamental question remains, is this isolation a curse or a blessing? Schopenhauer had no doubts. He believed that great thinkers should welcome solitude as a gift, for it is only in silence and detachment from the shallow currents of social life that they can achieve their greatest intellectual accomplishments. In his view, social life was not a place of genuine exchange or deep human connection, but rather a grand stage where people performed scripted roles in an endless play of appearances. To Schopenhauer, the true individual, one capable of independent thought and profound insight, could never fully belong to a society that thrives on conformity. He argued that the more someone understood about life and the world, the less they would want to participate in its everyday theater. Thus, he concluded that solitude was not only inevitable for the intelligent, it was essential. It was in this state of isolation that the mind could wander freely, undisturbed by the noise and nonsense of society, and tap into truths far beyond the reach of ordinary thought. Ultimately, Schopenhauer's view invites us to reconsider our assumptions about loneliness. Instead of seeing it solely as a painful condition to be avoided, he challenges us to recognize its potential as a powerful space for reflection, insight, and self-realization. While solitude may not be easy for the brilliant and the visionary, it may be the price, and the privilege, of seeing the world more clearly than most ever will. Self-interest was, in Schopenhauer's view, the central force guiding human behavior. He believed society to be nothing more than a grand stage where people performed for one another, hiding their true intentions behind carefully constructed masks. To him, sociability was not a sign of genuine connection but a veil that concealed the fundamental triviality of most human interactions. This bleak perspective was intricately linked to his major philosophical work, The World as Will and Representation, in which he argued that all reality is ultimately a projection of our own minds. Within this framework, social life appeared to him as a mere illusion, an ongoing spectacle that distracts individuals from the pursuit of deeper knowledge about themselves and the true nature of the world. Schopenhauer maintained that most people lived ensnared by insignificant worries, status, gossip, petty power struggles, and the constant craving for recognition. In his philosophy, the average human being was a slave to the will, a blind, irrational drive that governs our actions and traps us in an endless cycle of desires and frustrations. The pursuit of social validation, then, was merely a manifestation of this uncontrollable will. It was not a noble aspiration but a compulsive impulse, far removed from reason and reflection. This contempt for social life was not unique to Schopenhauer. Many other great thinkers shared his disillusionment with the superficiality of society. Friedrich Nietzsche, for example, famously remarked that convictions are more dangerous enemies of truth than lies. He emphasized how people cling to comforting illusions rather than confront reality with courage and honesty. For both Nietzsche and Schopenhauer, the tension between the search for truth and the demands of social life created an unbridgeable chasm. The intellectually superior, in striving for deeper understanding, naturally found themselves alienated from a world preoccupied with trivialities. However, this intellectual detachment came at a cost. Schopenhauer was fully aware that prolonged solitude could lead to disillusionment, emotional fatigue, and even disdain for the outside world. He warned that those who could see beyond society's illusions had no choice but to accept this harsh truth and learn to live with it. Solitude was both a burden and a necessity, an unavoidable reality for those whose minds reached beyond the superficial. But how exactly does this isolation manifest in everyday life? Why do those considered intellectually superior often feel frustrated by ordinary social interactions? Schopenhauer did not mince words when describing humanity. He believed that most people were driven by shallow, self-serving motivations, lacking any inclination toward deep thought or meaningful reflection. This created an inevitable gap between the intellectually elevated and the general masses, whom he saw as being distracted by trivial entertainment and material concerns. Mediocrity, in his view, only recognizes itself, while genius sees this mediocrity clearly, but finds itself alone. The intellectual isolation he described stemmed from a fundamental difference in orientation. While the ordinary person was absorbed in the pursuit of fleeting pleasures or social status, the thinker aimed to grasp the essence of existence itself. And when such thinkers tried to share their insights, they were often met with indifference, ridicule, or complete incomprehension. This helps explain why so many great minds throughout history became disillusioned with society. Schopenhauer himself disliked associating with average people because he believed that their mediocrity stifled the potential of the gifted few. This sentiment is echoed in Voltaire's well-known saying, "The secret of being a bore is to tell everything." The problem then wasn't merely a difficulty in communication, but a vast divergence of interests. While the genius seeks timeless truths, the average individual seeks pleasure and distraction. This fundamental conflict made social interaction a burden rather than a joy for those with exceptional minds. Nikola Tesla is a clear example. He avoided social events and mundane interactions, viewing them as pointless diversions that interfered with his work. Isaac Newton was known for his reclusive nature and lack of patience with small talk. Even Albert Einstein, arguably one of the most celebrated scientists in history, admitted that he often felt out of place in social settings. For all these individuals, solitude was not just preferable, it was essential to their intellectual pursuits. In Schopenhauer's view, this intellectual solitude was not a tragedy but a necessity. To be truly free, one had to separate oneself from the shallow pursuits of society. The deeper a person's thoughts, the less likely they were to find meaningful companionship. As he saw it, human society was a place of distraction, illusion, and false appearances. Only in solitude could the mind encounter the world as it truly was, stripped of vanity, performance, and noise. Thus, the philosopher concluded that those gifted with higher intelligence must embrace solitude not as a punishment, but as a pathway to truth. While isolation might bring melancholy, it also offered clarity. It stripped away the layers of pretense that dominated everyday life and gave the thinker space to explore existence with honesty and depth. In this sense, the solitude of the philosopher, the scientist, or the poet was not a social failure, it was a form of liberation. It was the price one paid for seeing the world not as it appears but as it is. Albert Einstein once confessed that he preferred solitude to the company of people who didn't share his passion for deep ideas. But the isolation experienced by brilliant minds isn't always a personal decision. It is often a reaction to how society treats those who think differently. Innovative or unconventional thinking frequently provokes discomfort or even hostility. Friedrich Nietzsche called this phenomenon the resentment of mediocrity, the tendency of the majority to scorn or attack what they don't understand or what makes them feel inferior. Thus, the genius doesn't merely choose solitude out of preference. Often they are pushed away by the very world they might seek to enlighten. This imposed distance can breed feelings of alienation and even a deep aversion to social life. Faced with this reality, a question naturally arises. If the world is hostile toward great thinkers, how should they navigate such a world? For Arthur Schopenhauer, the answer was not to try and conform but rather to embrace solitude as a haven for reflection and contemplation. In his philosophy, solitude was both destiny and choice. He saw isolation as an inevitable consequence of superior intelligence, but also as a golden opportunity for inner development. The ordinary person cannot bear solitude because they only feel at ease among others. The exceptional individual, on the other hand, seeks solitude because it is where they find themselves. This leads to a vital realization. Solitude is not punishment, it is privilege. It grants the thinker the space to dive into their own thoughts, free from distractions or the obligation to engage in the superficial social rituals that dominate everyday life. In this quiet sanctuary, creativity takes root and understanding deepens. Many of the world's most important thinkers, scientists, and artists lived with solitude as a close companion. Emily Dickinson spent most of her life in self-imposed seclusion, devoting herself to poetry. Immanuel Kant followed a rigid and solitary daily routine, famously uninterested in social gatherings. Ludwig van Beethoven, while gradually going deaf, retreated into isolation and produced some of the most powerful symphonies ever composed. Solitude not only allows for intellectual depth, it preserves the authenticity of genius. Schopenhauer warned that too much involvement with society could dilute the clarity and vision of a brilliant mind. This idea resonates with Buddhist teachings on detachment, one of Schopenhauer's key philosophical influences. Buddhism emphasizes that clinging to the external world, including social interaction, often leads to suffering. Real growth, it teaches, arises through introspection and the release of worldly illusions. Schopenhauer's alignment with this view helped him build his argument that solitude wasn't just a circumstantial reality for gifted individuals, it was essential for truth-seeking and personal development. However, solitude is not without its own challenges. Humans are inherently social beings. The desire to belong is woven into our biological fabric. Prolonged isolation, no matter how intellectually fruitful, can cause emotional pain and deep loneliness. Even those who cherished their solitude sometimes struggled with the absence of meaningful human connection. Nietzsche, for instance, also saw solitude as the path to greatness, but he acknowledged the suffering it could entail. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he described the philosopher as a hermit who descends from the mountains to share his wisdom with humanity, only to face rejection and misunderstanding. This captures the deep existential dilemma of the thinker. Withdrawing from society brings freedom, but also a heavy emotional toll. Schopenhauer, though, believed there was a way to resolve this paradox. While a genius could never fully belong in ordinary society, he proposed that one could still coexist with the world, without becoming engulfed by its mediocrity. The key, he suggested, was to cultivate a philosophical detachment, an emotional neutrality that would allow the individual to engage with others while remaining internally independent. This mental stance functioned as a shield, protecting the thinker's inner world from the noise and superficiality of mass culture. It wasn't about arrogance or withdrawal for its own sake. It was about self-preservation and clarity. By holding themselves at a distance emotionally and intellectually, exceptional individuals could preserve the purity of their thoughts without entirely cutting themselves off from others. This kind of selective interaction allows for practical coexistence without sacrificing one's ideals or inner peace. It's a strategy that doesn't reject humanity outright but approaches it with discernment. In the end, Schopenhauer's message was both cautionary and empowering. He didn't romanticize loneliness, he recognized its costs. But he also saw that for those with the capacity for deep thought and introspection, solitude was often the price of authenticity. Rather than lament this fate, he encouraged thinkers to accept and cultivate it, not out of bitterness but with the understanding that their minds were wired for a different path. Society may misunderstand, resist, or even resent those who challenge its norms. Yet the solitude that results from this tension can become fertile ground for profound insight. The thinker must learn to walk alone, not as a victim but as a seeker of truth. And in doing so, they may discover a sense of freedom and depth that the social world, with all its distractions and demands, can never offer. This path of philosophical detachment brings us to a crucial question. How can we navigate the world without being consumed by its superficiality? If possessing a brilliant mind often leads to solitude, how do great thinkers manage to live in society without feeling suffocated by its trivialities? Schopenhauer offered a compelling answer: the cultivation of philosophical detachment. For him, happiness belonged to those who were self-sufficient. The solution was not in trying to fit in or in changing others, but in adopting a serene, distanced attitude, like a quiet observer who studies life without becoming emotionally entangled in its chaos. Rather than battling the mediocrity of the world, the thinker should face it with the same curiosity a scientist has toward an experiment, interested but not emotionally invested. This means accepting the emptiness of many social rituals without irritation, recognizing the intellectual limitations of the majority without frustration, and preserving one's own mental independence without craving external validation. This kind of inner discipline echoes the philosophy of the Stoics, who emphasized emotional control in the face of adversity. The Roman emperor and Stoic philosopher Marcus Aurelius once wrote in his Meditations, "Give yourself the gift of indifference to what lies beyond your control." Indeed, the world will always be filled with noise, distractions, and superficial conversations. But it is up to the individual to determine how much of that truly deserves their attention. The philosopher, or anyone striving for deeper understanding, need not isolate themselves entirely from society. Instead, they should engage with it strategically, taking in only what is useful and discarding the rest. Though Schopenhauer was famously impatient with society and its conventions, he did not advocate for total isolation. He recognized that even the most profound thinkers need some degree of human contact, whether to exchange ideas or to prevent the harmful effects of absolute solitude. His advice was simple yet powerful: choose carefully whom you let into your life, and keep social interactions to the bare minimum necessary. Just enough to stay grounded in the world, but never so much that it clouds your mind or overwhelms your inner peace. This philosophy is perhaps more relevant today than ever. We live in an age dominated by digital distractions, fake news, and shallow connections. Knowing how to filter not just information but also relationships has become an essential skill. Intelligence today is not just about understanding the world intellectually, but also about navigating it wisely, knowing when to engage, when to retreat, and what to ignore. Schopenhauer's insight encourages us to stop lamenting the lack of deep connection with most people. Instead, we should see this as a symbol of our intellectual freedom. The solitude that sometimes feels like a burden can also be a tremendous privilege. A chance to explore the full depth of our thoughts without the constant interference of the outside world. So this brings us to a deeper, more personal question. Would you rather adapt to the world to feel accepted, or accept the world as it is, while preserving your intellectual independence? If you've made it this far in the reflection, it's likely that you already sense the answer. The link between deep thought and solitude isn't just an unfortunate byproduct of being different. It's a natural consequence of perceiving reality on a level that most do not. Schopenhauer showed us that brilliant minds often find more comfort in solitude than in the crowd, not out of arrogance, but because social interaction for them can become exhausting. Small talk, gossip, and the endless pursuit of superficial goals hold little appeal for those who have glimpsed the deeper workings of life and mind. When your thoughts operate on a more contemplative level, ordinary conversations can feel like noise, and ordinary goals can seem painfully empty. That doesn't mean such individuals lack compassion or social skills. It simply means that their inner world is often far richer and more demanding than the outer one. And so, they turn inward not to escape life, but to live it more authentically. The solitude they choose, or are sometimes forced into, becomes the space where they refine their understanding, protect their clarity, and develop ideas that can one day transform the very society from which they feel alienated. To live with a brilliant mind in a noisy world is not easy. It demands discipline, patience, and an unwavering commitment to truth. But Schopenhauer's philosophy reminds us that there is strength in standing alone, wisdom in detachment, and a kind of freedom that only comes when we no longer seek approval from the crowd. The challenge is to resist the pull of mediocrity while maintaining grace and dignity, to remain untouched by the chaos yet engaged with reality, and to walk among others while never losing touch with oneself. In the end, the life of the thinker is not one of isolation for its own sake, but of intentional separation, a chosen clarity in a foggy world. It is not loneliness but solitude. And in that solitude one can find not only peace, but the power to truly understand and perhaps even shape the world.